I think one of the most interesting things I've ever read is Nehru, I believe, once said that if he knew that Jinnah was so sick, he would have never yielded Pakistan to him. Which is like funny
See,
because it's like basically like I would have just like waited for him to die. You know, It's like, I'm just gonna keep saying no till he dies, and then we'll see what to do. Like, hello everyone. This is Monal Thaakar here, and I have with me my bhai Ujjwal Thaakar, and welcome to the second episode of the Fauji Brat Podcast. Bhai, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Are you excited for this episode?
Oh yeah, definitely. This
Yeah,
is one of my favorite topics,
right.
just because of the absurdity of the whole thing.
Right. So episode two of our podcast, as people watching this would already know, is called "Understanding Pakistan: Inside the Mind of an International Migraine." Now, before I take credit for that beautiful terminology, I would like to clarify that that term, international migraine, was used by the previous, the a former U.S. Secretary of State called Madeleine Albright back in 2008. And with that in mind, we'll also be uh, remembering another famous statement made by another former Secretary of State of the United States as on in the course of this podcast. But Bhai, I want to know from you as we start this podcast, like some opening remarks from you. What is Pakistan to you essentially? And uh, I mean that's a very I know a large vague question, but what has been your knowledge, understanding, or what have your feelings been towards Pakistan over the years as you've sort of grown up?
I mean, as a kid, I think the relevance of Pakistan for me was in terms of cricket.
Right, of course.
Uh, we did go through Kargil and all of that, but I don't really have any. Surprisingly, I don't. Even though I was older than you, I don't have any specific memories
Right.
of the Kargil war happening.
Hmm.
Like I don't remember there being any tension or anything like that. Surprisingly, I don't know why. In spite of the fact that we were posted in Jamnagar, which was quite near the border,
Hmm. Hmm.
and we were activated and all of that. So for me, the relevance was in terms of cricket that they were, and obviously like they were our enemies.
Right.
That's all I knew.
Right.
Like we partitioned and we used to be the same country. We separated, and now they're our enemies. But I didn't really have any sort of understanding of what kind of people they are, what mentality they are, because naively I used to think that they have the same thoughts about us. Like, I mean, of course they do,
Hmm.
but for me it was just that they are our neighbors, and we always have rivalry
Right.
in everything,
And they hate us or
especially with
something like
cricket.
that.
Yeah, and like we hate them and they hate us,
Hmm.
and that's it.
Hmm.
Little did I know, what that their perception and about us is sort of different in terms of the way we think about them
Hmm.
and the way they think about us,
Right.
and how the entire country basically lives in its own bubble.
Right.
I mean, largely
I,
speaking,
I guess what.
and how they have a completely like alternate view of the events that have happened
Right.
between us.
Right. I actually I think I know what you're trying to say. I guess what's surprising growing up for a lot of us is that this very fact that we know that a lot of them don't like us, but we just it's sort of a binary for us because we see ourselves as the good people and them as the bad people. and in a very generalized sense. What we don't realize is we know that they don't like us. What we don't realize is that they see themselves as the good people and us as the bad people. I think for me, growing up, that was a real realization because to sort of like you said, like history is completely different on that side of the border. So
I mean, I got that very early on that obviously, if we hate them and they hate us, it must be that they,
mm,
have a very different opinion. But I didn't have any idea about the extent to it because naively I used to think that the entire world agrees on history,
right,
on
yeah, there
facts.
are facts.
I used to think the entire world agrees on what facts are. That this is what
Yeah,
happened in this year, blah blah blah. Little did I know to what extreme this goes, and that how an entire country just thinks that a completely separate set of things happened in the last 70 years compared to us, and there's like no like completely opposing things,
yes, yeah,
and of course both can't be right.
correct. And as Fauji Brats especially, I think uh, we have a sort of a more interesting perspective towards Pakistan because for us it's a little the whole thing between India and Pakistan is a little closer to our hearts because our our parents, friends of our parents, and all these people, they would probably be our friends now who've grown up and joined the armed forces. They'll be in the first line of defense whenever anything happens with this country. So we seem to be a lot more critical, a lot more intrigued about this country than let's say a lot of the rest of India is.
Right.
And the another funny thing is that what I remembered was that our grandparents used to actually live in Karachi on our father's side before the partition, and then it was around the time of the partition that they actually came into India. So that's sort of a vague connection that we do have to the landmass that is right now Pakistan. And
True.
another interesting thing is I think we've been in all sectors of the border with Pakistan that India shares. Uh, we've been to the
Yeah.
Jammu and Kashmir.
I think that is something that probably most civilians would not have experienced.
Exactly.
Not that they can't, but probably would not have.
Yeah, over the years we've been to the Rajasthan border, uh, the Punjab border, the border in Jammu and Kashmir. Even now, what would be the Ladakh Union Territory upcoming year? Even the LOC on that front we have been to, which was in Turtuk, as we discussed in the last episode. And so yeah, we've sort of known it, I guess, or been affected by it and been in the know-how from a much closer quarter than also a lot of people have in the rest of the country. Uh, so, which is, I guess, why both of us have always been so interested in Pakistan and have discussed it at such length over the time. Especially if I talk about myself, I'm a what one would call a keen watcher, a keen Pakistan watcher, and it's something that has got me really excited for this particular episode. So, with that, I think we should come to the history of Pakistan, sort of discussing how Pakistan came into being and what it is. Like, how
Right.
much do you know about the history of Pakistan? What are your major, focus points whenever you think about Pakistan and its history?
Uh, I mean, I think broadly what I know is that uh, that the Muslim League basically was the Muslim League was basically of the opinion that the Muslims of India should have their own country,
Right.
and it was led by Mohammad Ali Jinnah,
Hmm.
and it was like a big point of contention till the last moment, and then finally probably Gandhiji gave in
Right.
and let Mohammad Ali Jinnah have his say. And what I've read quite recently, I would say in the last sort of maybe 2 3 years,
Hmm.
is that basically the idea behind Pakistan was that Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the sort of aristocrats,
Hmm.
or the Nawabs of UP
Hmm.
and the Nizam, like the state of Hyderabad, basically realized that they were going to lose their power,
Right.
especially Mohammad Ali Jinnah. I think he was pretty ambitious and he wanted to be like the father of the nation, or like a pivotal figure in the history of the nation formation. And I think he realized that although he was quite a senior leader, he didn't sort of figure in the top, couple of like 3 or 5 people.
Correct.
And he might never like make prime minister or president.
Hmm.
And therefore, to be that important, he would need to create his own uh, country. And I think people who wanted to still maintain their sort of aristocracy and their power, and retain their land and culture and whatever,
Hmm.
their Nawabi lifestyle, basically decided to create their own country on the basis of a religion. That's what I think, and what I know.
You're not
I'm not sure how correct that is.
you're not far off. You're actually very close to the truth. But for the rest of the audience and for your benefit also, I would now like to sort of add on and build upon that and give everyone a sort of a short history on Pakistan since its inception. So, what one would call the ideological father of Pakistan would be Allama Iqbal, who wrote the song "Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara." And he, very much like Jinnah, is supposed to have sort of gotten radicalized over the years when they were abroad, studying abroad or spending time abroad. And they came back completely changed with this idea of an Islamic nation. So Allama Iqbal, after writing the Tarana-e Hindustan, which is Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, wrote another song called Tarana-e Milli, where one of the most pivotal lines is that uh, Cheen, Arab, Sara Jahan hai hamara, Muslim hai hum, something, something, something. So it's basically about talking about pan-Islamism. And he was the one sort of who brought up the first idea of Pakistan, of carving out a Muslim nation out of India. And the ironical bit is that he died before independence, so he actually never got to see it. He lived and died an Indian. But what he did was he inspired Mohammad Ali Jinnah, who was the leader of the Muslim League, to take this whole idea up. Now you're very right in the sense that Jinnah felt very sidelined, because I believe even in the elections that happened, the provincial elections that happened in, I believe, either 1937 or 1939, the Muslim League did very, very poorly. I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but they lost to Congress in a lot of the Muslim seats. So essentially, that was when this idea sort of got cemented, where Jinnah felt that if there were to be a united India, he would largely have no political relevance. And in thinking so, he basically cemented this idea of Pakistan, and it was passed at Lahore. It's called the Lahore Resolution, where they passed this idea that there has to be a Pakistan. In 1946, when he felt his demands wouldn't be met, he called for a direct action day, which called for Muslims to violently, especially that's what resulted in the Calcutta killings, to violently take control and demand Pakistan. And as you rightly said, finally these people caved in, and so Pakistan was born on the 15th of August, as we discussed in the last episode, and not on 14th of August.
Yeah.
And another very interesting theory about the creation of Pakistan is, I don't know to what extent this is verified, but I've heard this and I've read about this from a lot of people, is that the British and the Americans were very interested in the creation of a separate state in the northwest of India, which was dependent on the west, to act as a buffer state, basically, between them and give them a space between them and the Soviet Union, the ever expanding Soviet Union, especially as the Second World War was nearing its end, where friends were soon turning foes and they were all spying on each other. So it was in the hawks that were there in the British services and the American services.
But wouldn't Afghanistan have served as that buffer state?
No, Afghanistan is sort of, as we should do an episode on Afghanistan later on, but we would show how Afghanistan was much more difficult to control, is much more difficult to control, and
right, as it is today.
Yeah, and will forever be. So I think that's something we should go into in a separate episode. But basically, they felt that a country that would be carved out and would receive like a small amount of resources and without any
Mm-hmm.
essentially to be created out of a thin air, and that's what Pakistan is. It's not a historical nation. It's not a
Right.
not even a cultural nation. It's a nation based on religion essentially, and there are very
Right.
few countries like that. I think another example would that I can only think of is something like Israel, and I can't remember any other countries that have been founded on the basis of a religion. Especially, all your Islamic countries are actually ethnic countries. There's Iran, there is Iraq, there is
Right.
Saudi Arabia. So these all places have their own people who are part of this country. But Pakistan is
Yeah.
essentially, I mean, if you look at it, half of it is Malab. The majority population is Punjabis, and Punjab is
Yeah.
another dominant culture in India as well. So it's not like
Right.
it needs to be a separate nation. It's just the religious bit
Correct.
uh, that made them ask for a separate nation, which really doesn't stand any ground in the history of
Right.
nations
Right.
that have been created. So
I had a quick question.
yeah,
Do we know anything about why, let's say, Mohammad Ali Jinnah or Allama Iqbal got radicalized in, like, UK basically? That's not the place where most
uh,
people get radicalized,
I
especially in
haven't.
19, what,
No,
15? What year
I
was
mean,
this?
you're probably
20.
thinking of it radicalized in a very different sense. It's
Not
yeah,
radicalized in the way we think about today, but they formed really like staunch opinions
yeah.
about like their identity and pan-Islamism.
I'm pretty sure it had to do a lot more with the sort of maybe the exposure they got or the company they kept there. Where
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Allama Iqbal, another similar facet to him as to Jinnah is the jealousy that a lot of people say he had in him because of being denied the
Yeah,
same publicity as
Rabindranath Tagore.
Tagore, right? So including the
Yeah.
Nobel Prize. Also, I remember this
Mm.
really brilliant article that I had read about Tagore having been a state guest of the Shah of Iran, and Allama Iqbal
Mm.
not having been accorded the the same favor. And Iqbal
But you
actually,
wouldn't if you keep repeating the same tune. I mean, you want to win the Nobel Prize, at least like create another original tune.
of course, of course he did, but yeah, so he didn't get invited, and he actually wrote to the Shah of Iran, complaining sort of that I am a Muslim, you're a Muslim. Why are you not inviting me? Why are you inviting Tagore? He's not even Muslim, and I mean, I wish Tagore was alive to see the day where his two nation theory really broke apart. We'll come to this later, and when East Pakistan became Bangladesh, and it adopted a Tagore song as its national anthem. So,
Right.
I think if Iqbal saw that coming, he would even be more furious.
But like, is he celebrated in Pakistan today?
Iqbal
I
is
never hear his name.
tremendously celebrated in Pakistan.
I
He's
never hear his name.
oh no, he's been appropriated by Pakistan entirely. Allama Iqbal is definitely one of there's a Urdu name for him as well, something on the lines of Qaid Azam, which is for Mohammad Ali Jinnah, basically adhering him
Mm-hmm.
to as the ideological father of Pakistan. So there is definitely something that he is called, and he has his own special part in Pakistan's history till now. But yeah, as I was saying, so a lot of people say that it was a buffer state for the Americans
Mm-hmm.
and the British for future conquest into Afghanistan. And remember, another reason is that they did not directly administer Afghanistan at that point. They only administered certain bits of it that they had won in the Anglo-Afghan wars, which were then a part of United India, and today is the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, where the Balakot bombings had happened. So that small, strip of land on Punjab's west, Pakistani Punjab's west, is actually
Mm-hmm.
older Afghanistan, ancient Afghanistan.
Which is that the like the area which they show in K3?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. So in the film
Mm.
Kesari, they are holding on to that very bit, and that's the only bit of Afghanistan that they actually always kept, and which later went on to India and Pakistan after independence. So the whole idea has been since the 19th century, early 19th century. So that's almost 200 years ago from now. Has been the great game in Afghanistan that has been unfolding because Afghanistan is known to be the place where empires converge. So the Soviet Empire and the British Empire were empires were converging to Afghanistan at
Mm-hmm.
Afghanistan, and there has always been a game
Mm-hmm.
between these empires as to who will capture Afghanistan, and no one's been able to capture Afghanistan. So again, we'll come to that on a later episode. But basically,
Sure.
Pakistan was seen as that buffer state which they could use and they did use in the future to establish military
Mm.
bases, to
So,
influence, to
mhm.
aid, so as to have an eye on what the Soviet Empire was essentially doing.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
yeah,
did the Britishers also draw the sort of western line for Pakistan, the western boundary?
they did. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So it's the line with Afghanistan is called the Durand line,
Mm-hmm.
and the
Okay.
eastern border with India is called the Radcliffe line.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's how Pakistan was created. And you very rightly said that a lot of the Sardars and Vaderas of the United Provinces and Punjab and all felt that their
Yeah.
land ownership will go, which it did. I mean, because India passed the Zamindari Act the first 5 years into independence. If you've seen the movie
Mm.
Lutera, especially, that whole impact is shown very
Yeah.
nicely. And you'll be surprised to this day, if I'm not wrong, in Pakistan there is no laws against zamindari. So that same system is still persistent in Pakistan. So basically, what it was,
Mm.
created for all these landlords to stay rich and for their workers to not have land rights and remain poor.
Right.
So that's how essentially how Pakistan came into being, and we'll discuss on a later subject of how all these provinces that it has and what all provinces it has and how they sort of joined in into Pakistan, legitimately and illegitimately.
Mm-hmm.
But quickly going through the rest of the history of Pakistan after creation was the major points are the 47-48 war with India, which saw it expand its territory into that one-third area of Kashmir that we discussed in the previous episode, and shall do in a future episode uh, if we end up speaking more on Kashmir. So basically, that 47-48 war was when they instigated the tribals from the Pashtun belt to attack Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, and
Mm.
ended up capturing a huge chunk of it before the Indian forces were called in after the instrument of accession, and they pushed them back, but they still, remained with that one-third part of Kashmir, which added to Pakistani territory. So immediately after independence, they gained a lot of territory, and following that was a decade of instability in Pakistan, basically. From you would say from 48 to 58 is the decade of instability where no one knows where Pakistan is really
Mm.
going. Only by the latter half of that decade uh, do they make some really interesting changes and additions to their foreign policy. So the first prime
Mm.
minister of Pakistan, basically, how where it all goes wrong is that first of all, Mohammad Ali Jinnah dies in 1948, and very
I think
early.
that is the point we probably missed. That is that he was also suffering from
Oh yeah,
TB and he knew he was going to die, and that's why that could be another motivation for
maybe,
like trying
maybe,
to cement his place in history.
maybe. Yeah, that's also very true.
Like he might have never survived enough, like
Yeah,
enough years to be able
yeah.
to
I don't know
make
if
it big.
he was sure he was gonna die or something, but I'm sure he
Yeah,
knew he
sure.
was very very sick, and
But I think in those days, TB meant death.
yeah,
There was no cure.
I guess.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things I've ever read is Nehru, I believe, once said that if he knew that Jinnah was so sick, he would have never yielded Pakistan to him, which is like funny
See.
because it's like basically like I would have just like waited for him to die. You know, It's like, I'm just gonna keep saying no till he dies, and then we'll see what to do. Like, but of course, that information, that news was never came to him, and what happened. But
I wonder how they never noticed any changes in his
I
physique.
mean, he was really skinny. I if I had a long term friend who had turned 4 and he was suddenly very skinny, I I would, if
But
he
I mean,
looked sick,
the cuffing,
yeah,
the cuffing.
that's what I'm saying. But like I know Kejriwal cuffs, so
As
no
Vivek
one,
Oberoi says, if you cough for like more than 6 weeks, you could have TB.
yeah.
So I'm pretty sure they noticed that over like
I don't think they had
long
that
period.
ad back then, so they didn't know.
They didn't have Vivek Oberoi.
They didn't have I mean, we have Vivek Oberoi, and we still don't question Arvind Kejriwal about his health. So I guess some people do, but not a lot of people.
Yeah.
But yeah, so basically, then Jinnah died, and the second major death that happened in Pakistan was in 1951 when the first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan of Pakistan, he was assassinated in a park.
Ouch.
Yeah, for one of his political meetings, and that park is now called Liaquat Bagh and all that. So it's he's in essentially one of the longest serving prime ministers of Pakistan, though never duly elected from 1947 to 1951. And
So he died a year before completing his term.
yeah, and I guess that's where the curse started, where no Pakistani prime minister has ever completed a term. I think
Yeah.
it should be
So
called
do we
the.
know who assassinated him?
It was some civilian who was like angry with him about something. I don't know the exact details of it, but it was like a
Okay.
lone wolf sort of attack. And
I think those were the days when, you know, civilians could do that.
yeah, okay. Moving on. So he died. He died in 1951, and with that, essentially the Liaquat curse, if you can call it, started. And for the next 7 years, all there were like another 4 or 5 prime ministers, I believe, and
In 7 years.
in 7 years there were 4 or 5 prime ministers, and they lasted for all of them had a average span of like 1.5 year or something like that. And just a second, yeah, uh, they had a span of roughly 1.5, 2 years, sort of. And what happened
Hmm.
was because of this instability, uh,
Hmm.
in 1958, General Ayub Khan, did a coup and took
One
over.
second, one second. What do you mean by they had a span of 1.5? Like, did they get assassinated?
No,
Or
so
were they,
there were no
what happened?
there were no elections. So these people were actually being elected by people who had been elected in the provincial uh, sort of elections that had happened in the 30s. I think the only real like parliamentary election
30 as in?
the pre-independent provincial elections.
What's that?
Like I was saying that where Jinnah didn't get enough votes in 1937 and stuff like that.
Oh, okay, okay,
There
okay.
were provincial elections conducted under the Indian Independence Act by the British to yield some sort of powers to regional powers to Indians and basically home rule sort of.
Okay.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
yeah. There were, so that's why you had a lot of chief ministers of like Bombay State and
But then who
Punjab.
chose that Liaquat Ali Khan would be the first prime minister?
That
Mohammad
was
Ali Jinnah.
that was internally decided by the Muslim League and their allies.
Okay. So
Yeah,
did they just have one party?
I'm not too sure of that. I think they had a couple of parties, but I think there were no real opposition parties except for I think the Communist Party in Pakistan and other left parties. There's a small sliver of left in Pakistan as well.
Hmm.
So basically,
Okay.
those one and a
Anyway.
half, 2 years were basically these stand-in prime ministers who would come and they would get removed and they would come and they would, sort of
Right.
keep coming and going. And
Hmm.
in 1958 was when Ayub Khan, who was then the chief of army staff, the Pakistani chief of
Hmm.
army staff, he sort of took over and
Hmm.
uh, he enforced martial law and he became the dictator of Pakistan. And he remained the dictator of Pakistan for another 11 years. And in that time, he promoted himself to field marshal. As like that's a yeah, great thing to do. But what had just
Hmm.
happened before he took office,
Hmm.
in the latter half of the 50s, I think he was the great force behind it as well. Was they signed this treaty called Seattle with America, which, if I'm not wrong, is the Southeast Asian uh, Treaty Organization, like NATO, North Atlantic Treaty
Ah,
Organization. So they essentially
okay.
became they were no longer like India was a non-aligned country. They were not a non-aligned country. They were an
Hmm.
ally. They were a written ally of the Americans. And
Right.
which what I had mentioned in the last episode as well, that that is when Nehru decided that there could not be a plebiscite in Kashmir, because he knew that the full force of America would be behind Pakistan in all their territorial claims. So this sort of
Right.
happened in the late 50s. Ayub Khan took over, and he was there for 11 years. And
Hmm.
in the I think in early 60s, 60, 61, he signed the Indus Water Treaty with Nehru thinking that there's not that this will help in there not being any more wars between India and Pakistan, because Pakistan would be grateful that we are giving them some excess water, and that's what the treaty Nehru signed. And
He thought there won't be a war because of it.
I mean, it'll be more unlikely, I guess. That's what he was quite naive. We all know that, but
That's why we celebrate Children's Day on his birthday.
but but I guess a lot of people do attribute that fact and say that
Which year was this again?
60 or 61. I'm not 100% sure, but it was either 60, 61, 62, that time frame.
He just made a lot of bad decisions in 60,
Yeah, yeah, he did.
or like at least a couple of major
Yeah,
ones. Anyway,
yeah,
yeah.
he did. And but a lot of people say that that's one of the reasons why Pakistan did not attack us during the China War in 62, uh, where they could have attacked us
Hmm.
on the western sector and made things even more difficult for us. So
Hmm.
there are a lot of theorists who also say that there was a time where Pakistan had covertly offered India to team up against to battle Chinese hegemony in the region, and India, of course, with its Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, Indo-Sino relations, supposedly booming, had declined the offer. And it was after this
Wow.
declining, and India and Pakistan being at loggerheads, it naturally meant that Pakistan and China became friends and came together. And it was around that time
Hmm.
that in 63, as we mentioned in the last episode, the Shaksgam Valley was ceded to China.
Yeah.
So this happens, and basically Ayub Khan is still president, and he's doing really well for himself. It's often called, the 60s are often called the decade of uh, progress in Pakistan, because new money from America was just flowing in. So
Right.
apparently there were like a lot of good reforms and a lot of money and a lot of
Hmm.
people having a great time economically, culturally, socially. Things were not so conservative back then in Pakistan, at least in the big cities like Lahore and especially Karachi, which is like the Mumbai of Pakistan. What happened in one of
Right.
what happened was, when he was on this high, of sort of being so successful, he decided
Hmm.
to have another crack at Kashmir and start the second Kashmir war in 1965. And
Hmm.
basically, what had happened was, I think Pakistan had done a couple of military exercises with America in that same time,
Hmm.
because of the same
Hmm.
Seattle and all of that. And the American military sort of told them, when they war gamed with them, that because of their qualitative difference, because they were getting a lot of qualitative machinery, giving it to Pakistan, that Pakistan in simulation would actually be able to defeat India, which India had largely
Hmm.
vintage machinery, because we were non-aligned and we were really buying these new machineries at really costly prices, which was not the
Hmm.
case with Pakistan. And that really emboldened the
Hmm.
army and Ayub Khan to sort of go to war. So they launched Operation Gibraltar and
Hmm.
went to war with India in Kashmir. And as
Hmm.
to cut that whole thing short, basically they started by invading Kashmir and ended up defending Lahore. And that's
Hmm.
where sort of the ceasefire happened. And I would say, in my opinion, they lost the war. A lot of people would call it a stalemate, because aren't conclusive victories. Conclusive victories are only the ones
Right.
where there is a surrender, basically, right? But
But didn't we like reach Lahore?
yeah, we did. I mean, we also lost territory in Punjab, in Kashmir, but overall we gained almost 4 times the territory that they gained. So that combined with the fact that Pakistan could not achieve the primary objective of the war, which was to capture Kashmir,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
essentially, in my opinion and in the opinion of a lot of historians, means we won the war. And the interesting, funny bits about this war, I can't even begin to like explain. One of those like motivating factors for the Pakistani army apparently was that they used to be told that one Muslim is equal to like 10 Hindus. So, and I heard this hilarious thing that by 1971 it had shifted to one Muslim is equal to 5 Hindus. because because of the beating they sort of
Adjustment.
yeah, because the sort of beating they got in the
Calibration.
yeah 65 war. So they couldn't live with that myth anymore. And just bizarre stuff in the 65 war. So in Pakistan, they basically think that they won the 65
Yeah.
war, and they had some really bizarre stories going around that I know you're gonna die laughing at this, but basically they were telling their people that soldiers were coming back and telling their people that we saw these angels come down, and basically like whenever India fired a bomb, they would like take the bomb and like throw it into the river and stuff like that. Yeah, I am not joking. I am not joking. That I don't know where I read it. It's going to be very difficult to find, but if I find it, I'm definitely putting it up on the screen. It's an extract from some Pakistani officer's book about the 65 war, that they were writing that all
Yeah.
these Angel Gabriel, which is Gibral and all, they were like coming down and like stopping, and like these soldiers, Pakistani soldiers who like suddenly got divine powers, and like they would stand in front of tanks and the tanks wouldn't work. And,
I mean,
uh,
these are one-off cases of people writing that.
they're writing this that these were the stories that were being circulated,
Okay.
and there are
Okay.
other people who corroborated that they also heard these stories in that time. So they're obviously, I mean, obviously they're rumors, but these
Right.
rumors were sort of
Right.
widespread. So
Hmm.
yeah, so it sort of just gives you an insight into the kind of mind. I mean, you would probably never hear a story like this on the Indian end, right? Like, imagine like yeah, an Indian saying that this. I mean, we pray. People in our country pray a lot, but like imagine saying that this God came and took the bombs away and all of that. It's. I mean, it's
Yeah. I mean, we don't expect God to actually show up.
yeah. It's not the Mahabharata.
Literally.
Yeah, it's not really the
Yeah.
Mahabharata. We're talking about the 1960s for God's sake. And
Yeah.
there are a lot of these bizarre things happened in the 60s. Another interesting